All right, let's move to Iran because it has long been the kind of ultimate wet dream of Israel and Netanyahu to lure the United States into a regime change war with Iran, because that would get rid of what is by far is Israel's greatest competitor, most formidable competitor in that region. They obviously, prior to the 1979 revolution that ushered in the current government, had what was essentially an American puppet and a dictator, the Shah of Iran, who the U.S. installed in 1953 by overthrowing the then government, created enormous amounts of resentment inside Iran for the United States for the obvious reason. Countries, as you said, don't like when foreign governments come in and overthrow their government and impose on them a dictatorship. Um, Clearly, there is grievance and dissatisfaction among some substantial portion, non-trivial portion of the Iranian people with their government. A lot of it is economic, and as you said, the result of things the United States has done to Iran that have caused that. Obviously, most countries in the world have a non-trivial portion of their population with intense grievances against their leaders, including the United States. So there are protests, and that says something, but it only takes you so far. How do you see these protests in terms of whether, without overt intervention from the United States, they pose a threat to the Islamic Republic?
Well, let me just say very quickly, when we talk about overt American intervention, we're talking about air power. We're talking about bombing Iran. And to be honest, I believe that if anything, if we bomb Iran, we will put an end to the protests and people will rally around the flag. You want to remember that that's what happened during the 12-day war in June. Before the 12-day war started, Israel started it on June 13th. It ended 12 days later, June 25th, and we attacked Iran for one day on June 22nd. But during that period, the populace rallied around the flag. They rallied around the government. And I believe that if we were to launch a major air campaign along with the Israelis against Iran now, that there would be a rally around the government effect. So I think if you're the United States,
Similar to how, in a way, October 7th saved Netanyahu. I mean, Israel was on the verge of major internal strife, and it kind of all disappeared with the Hamas attack on October 7th, and it caused a certain unity behind the government. That's very normal.
yeah, and I even go beyond that. In Netanyahu's case, he's continued to wage war after war after war. He's turned Israel into a permanent warfare state, and I believe that he thinks, and it's probably correct. I'm sad to say that fighting all these wars will keep the people basically on his side. They'll complain about him personally. They don't like him. They wish he wasn't there in a certain sense, but they're really glad he's there when it comes to waging war because he's proved that he's effective at waging war. So I think you see that with Netanyahu, not only on October 7th, but beyond October 7th. And I think you would see the same thing in Iran. So I think using military force doesn't make any sense. I actually think in a lot of these cases, if the United States would just get out of a country's face, it would do a lot to produce regime change and a more pro American government. And my favorite example of this, by the way, is Cuba. I think we have threatened Cuba since roughly 1959. We can't take our gun sights off Cuba. It's just an obsession with us. And I think that external threat from the Yankees up north does a great deal to keep Cuba, the Cuban regime, intact. I think we would be much smarter if we wanted to foster regime change in Cuba to just back off and just have good relations with Cuba and let American culture, which acts like acid, bring down the regime in Cuba. But we're incapable of doing that. We have to get right up in a country's face. Now, what's going on in Iran? To tell you the truth, Glenn, it's very hard to say. You were talking about propaganda before and how deadly effective American propaganda is. As I was listening to your talk, I was sort of nodding without moving my head. You're exactly right. And when you listen to the American government and the Israeli government, which is also terrific at propaganda, they tell a story that the regime is on its last legs, and shortly, in a short period of time, that regime is going to be toppled, and we're going to have a new and friendly regime. Uh, there are lots of people on the other side of this debate, and these are knowledgeable people who simply think that's not true. The regime has faced protests before. The regime is ruthless. It has lots of support, and it is now moving to suppress the regime, suppress the protests. And in fact, what you're seeing in some cities is massive protests in favor of the regime. Now, what's the bottom line here? It's very hard to say, again, because we're dealing with so much propaganda from both sides. So I don't know where this all ends. If I had to bet, I would bet on the regime shutting these protests down.
One question is you have Iran has allies. I think, for a long time, people thought that you couldn't remove Assad because of the importance that the Assad government had toward Russia. That was a major Russian base of influence in the Middle East. And it sort of seems like Russia pretty much accepted that he was gone and was falling, and maybe they had washed their hands of him. Some reports suggested that, but they certainly didn't do anything, nowhere near what people expected they might, if the Assad regime was actually in danger of falling. And then you have Venezuela, which has had a traditionally close relationship with Russia, had been dealing with China. Maduro's gone. Very little objection or backlash, it seems, from what the countries that ought to have been his allies. Obviously, the Cubans are the most important ally, and there's only so much they can do. But now you have Iran, which clearly is what, however organic these protests are, you clearly have the Mossad fueling them. There's lots of conclusive evidence that that's the case. You have Trump threatening to bomb Iran in order to help the protests, to facilitate them. Why are Iranian allies like Russia or China, that does at least some business with Iran, so seemingly indifferent to all of these cases?
It's, I think, very simple. They have no military option. I mean, that's certainly true in the Russian case. The Russians are involved in a major war in Ukraine, and they're deeply committed to ending that war. And the last thing they want to do is take their eye off the ball and get involved in a war or any kind of military conflict with the United States over Iran. It just would not be in their interests. And therefore, with regard to both Iran and Venezuela, they've allowed the Americans to pretty much have their way. And they've instead, the Russian leaders have concentrated on doing everything they can to win the war in Ukraine. And with regard to China, China's, so far away from Venezuela and so far away from Iran, and it has so little power projection capability. China has a growing amount of military capability in East Asia, and it is building a blue water navy to project power into the Persian Gulf. But it's a long way from where it has that kind of power projection capability. And you want to remember, they're up against the United States of America, which is a true superpower and has huge capabilities at projecting power into the Middle East or the Persian Gulf. And furthermore, Venezuela is in our backyard, right? They'd be entering into our backyard. And that would, of course, invoke the Monroe Doctrine and so forth and so on. So there's no way China or Russia are going to pull either Venezuela or Iran's chestnuts out of the fire.
Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page.
You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.